Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nida Rahman. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Architecture at CMU. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a South Asian woman with short, dark hair. Along with my co-organizer, Aparna Parikh, who is assistant teaching professor in women's gender and sexuality studies at Penn State, I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to this conversation on lively cities. We greet you from occupied and settled territories of Indigenous people who have stewarded this land for generations: Lenni-Lenape, Shawnee, Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, and many others. Our acknowledgement comes with the recognition and grief that thefts of Indigenous land, dispossession, and destruction of lives, livelihoods, and ecologies and ecological relations are ongoing. These are continuously met, however, with struggle by Indigenous peoples and allies here in Turtle Island, as well as in Palestine and Gaza, in Sudan, Congo, Kashmir, and elsewhere. So we stand in solidarity with calls and efforts towards ceasefire, land back, environmental justice, and abolition everywhere. We started the South Asian Urban Climates Collective in 2019 as a series of dialogues about the place of South Asian cities as crucial sites of climate change, taking the changing of climates to be inextricable from the historically situated ongoing logics of colonization and erasure. Mainstream discourses on the effects of the global climate crisis in South Asia are normally focused in developmentalist terms on economic, infrastructural, or national security impacts, with cities often portrayed as sites of acute risk or as levers of resilience. But these discourses leave out the intersections of these processes with local histories, politics, and experiences. Afghan refugees that Pakistan has been deporting in the recent weeks, for example, have been at the front lines of climate emergencies such as flooding and long subject to evictions and displacements in urban centers. Authoritarian crackdowns on peaceful uprisings of farmers in India and arrests of climate activists in their wake, tourism-based land grabs and ongoing contestations in Sri Lanka, along with other legacies of colonial and post-colonial policies and the caste, class, and gendered politics of the urban, remind us of the differentiated place-based experiences of urban climates. The South Asian Urban Climates Project seeks to capture climate across political, social, historic, atmospheric, ecological, material, sensory, and embodied registers, and ask how urban climates are historically situated and multiply experienced. This project also seeks to foster a transnational and interdisciplinary community of scholars, educators, artists, and other practitioners working closely and critically at the intersections of climate, politics, and urbanism in South Asia and beyond. Earlier this year, we launched our website and published an article in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Studies, which was, for us, a really lovely experience experimenting with thinking and writing together on these themes with 12 amazing co-authors, one of whom, Wakas, joins us today as panelists. So we'll put the links of both of those things in the chat in a minute. And so it is in this spirit that we're absolutely delighted to welcome our panelists in conversation about Man Barua's new book, Lively Cities, Reconfiguring Urban Ecology, which was published earlier this year by the University of Minnesota Press. The book is a journey through unexplored spaces that foreground new ways of inhabiting the urban. Lively Cities focuses on the multitude of entities, human and non-human, that make up the material politics of city making, helping us rethink infrastructure, the built environment, design, habitation, and everyday practices of dwelling in post-colonial cities. Man Barua is an environmental and urban geographer whose research focuses on the economies, ontologies, and politics of the living and material world. He's a university lecturer in human geography at the University of Cambridge. Our panelists today, our respondents, are Wakas Bhatt, Asila Haq, and Avadendra Sharan. Wakas Bhatt is assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Toronto. His recently published book, Life Beyond Waste, Work in Infrastructure in Urban Pakistan, was published earlier this year by Stanford University Press and is based on long-term ethnographic fieldwork in Lahore and in the Punjab, examining how waste workers, who are predominantly from low or non-caste groups, have become essential components of urban life through the everyday and intimate workings of waste infrastructures. Asila Haq is a PhD candidate and lecturer in the Department of Urban Geography at Free University Berlin in Germany. Her work draws on infrastructure studies, urban theory, science and technology studies, and more than human geography. And her dissertation research, an ethnography of roads in Karachi, Pakistan, is concerned with the politics of flyovers, roadworks, uneven development, and everyday pigeon-human interactions on the road. Avadendra Sharan is the director of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. He works at the intersection of urban and environmental studies to develop understandings of the urban as constituted through socio-ecological processes, resource use, the making of waste and pollution, and the quest for purity of air and water, spatial planning, etc., all of these as they're mediated by relations of power. He's the author of In the City, Out of Place, Nuisance, Pollution and Dwelling in Delhi, circa 1850 to 2000, published by Oxford University Press in 2014, and Dust and Smoke, Air Pollution and Colonial Urbanism, India, circa 1860 to 1940, published by Orient Black Swan in 2020. So with that, we will invite our panelists to each provide comments for about 8 to 10 minutes, followed by a response by Man. And just panelists, we'll give you a sort of a quiet indication at about 9 minutes. And after Man has had an opportunity to respond, we'll open up to the audience for questions and more dialogue. In the meanwhile, as we go along, please, audience, please feel free to post your questions in the chat. And Aparna and I will do our best to monitor that. And then just a quick note before we start, we'll mute everyone right now so that we can have a clear recording and the presentations are easily legible, but please, or audible, please do remember to unmute if you have questions. So with that, I'll invite Vikas to start.
All right, great. Yeah, I'll try to keep it in the 8 to 10 minutes and keep an eye out for the warning as well. I wrote a bunch of thoughts, and so I'm worried that yeah, it might run off. But in any case, I'd like to first thank Nida and Aparna for organizing this panel discussion and inviting me to comment on a wonderful monograph. So I'll sort of just get right into it maybe, and before sort of dealing with the substantive comments, obviously I'd like to thank Man for writing this book, and I sort of want to start with sort of commenting on sort of how theoretically lucid and empirically nuanced the text was. When I first received the book about a couple of weeks ago, I saw it was almost 300 pages, and I was slightly worried because I had to read it all and get comments. But it was really a pleasure to read, and it went by very quickly in a good way. And I think that's because you do something that a lot of us sort of aspire to, and that's seamlessly intertwined theory and ethnography. And I think that's a bit controversial coming from an anthropologist describing the work of a non-anthropologist that way. But I think it's a part of the manuscript that really should be foregrounded. The theoretical expositions, right? They not only build off and clarify the ethnographic materials, but the two of these, theory and ethnography, are often fused so firmly together, you sort of lose the boundary between those two. And that goes for as much for the ethnographic vignettes as it does for your historical analysis too. I think you do a really good job of sort of bringing the theory into a very sort of productive relationship to your empirical materials. And I think it's this attentiveness that allows you to locate what you sort of really emphasize as the minor languages that are fashioned out of major vocabularies of urban theory that are handed down to us. And I think that is where I'll sort of turn to maybe some substantive comments on the book. And I think a lot of mine will be dealing with sort of the theoretical interventions of the book, as well as sort of, pushing some of the empirical materials you also kind of present along the way. And so the distinction, and I'm sure this will be coming out in other comments in our conversation, between minor and major in urban theory. It's one that really undergirds the book and reappears in different ways at different moments, right? So something like the ecologies of infrastructures, human and other human relations, recombinant urbanisms, circuits of capital and non-capital, seem to be able to play out across major and minor keys at different moments, right? And so early on in the text, Mann provides, a sort of tentative definition of what the minor key of urban theory kind of looks like. And I'm quoting you here from page 15, to write the urban in a minor key then is to render urban grammar into a polyphony, albeit in the same language as that of the major theory. It is about working with the same terrain or field while opening up established modes of practices to variations. And you say, I mean, I'm really curious to kind of hear more about this. You say these are not in the major and minor are not in antagonistic relations to each other, right? The two simply have different aims, right? And it seems like Mann, I'm not sure to address you as Mann or you exactly, but in any case, I think Mann tries to hold on to both, right, the major and minor keys of urban theory, right? He doesn't want to give away or give up completely on the major sort of vocabulary of urban theory, because both are sort of necessary to account for urban life, right? For a variety of reasons, the major of urban theory is necessary for urban planning, something like understanding informality of economic activity. These kinds of questions are important to explore, but they're insufficient. I mean, I think that's where the book is kind of making a claim, especially if we want to account for the potentialities woven into the fabric of urban life, right? So the minor is sort of imminent, right, to the urban form. And I think that's where this attention to spaces of creativity, improvisation, variation, where these are imminent in the major vocabularies of urban theory. And I think the book provides us some of the tools to start tracing some of those minor languages, right? And what they tell us about what it means to sort of inhabit urban ecologies. And here I sort of want to pose a question maybe to Mann and to all of us to sort of think about. The minor key is something else, is tied up with this term of the otherwise that you use sporadically throughout the text. And you say, at one point you say, the writing otherwise is necessary because of the cramped space of the major key of theory, right? So everyone wants to talk about the major key, and it takes up all the space. So you have to really, the search for the minor language is a search for the otherwise. And that's how you end the book, actually, right? It's a very powerful statement. So I want to kind of ask you to sort of say why you end it this way. And Mann says at the end of the book, for the minor gives us the great arsenal of all, the power of thinking and acting otherwise. And, I'm curious to hear a few things of where this language, of otherwise is coming from for you. I know a little bit of this for maybe urban geographers through the writing on fugitivity, and the undercommons is one space for that. In anthropology, I'm aware of this sort of coming through queer and feminist studies, animal studies, affect theory, these kinds of things. And it seems like, the book is almost read as a pursuit of the otherwise, right, of the urban otherwise. And it often reads that way, right, as an inquiry into that. And so I'm wondering about what it means to render visible or noble that which is otherwise, right? And I'm thinking both of this context of fugitivity, right, and the undercommons, but also the work of Edward Glissant in Poetics of Relation, right? He makes a claim about opacity as a sort of political ethical imperative, right? Especially for colonized people. And so I feel, so with that's sort of kind of central, I think, theoretical framework of the text between major and minor, and I'm happy to have, hopefully, we can have more conversation about that. And now I'll just sort of talk about one point that is sort of an empirical, but also a conceptual part of the book. And this, is around the question of commensality, right? It's a key part of several chapters, empirical chapters, and sort of some conceptual claims that you're making, right? And this, this is, I want to present this as a provocation, and not maybe as sort of a criticism in a very constructive, generous type of way. And so commensality, right, for some may not be aware, right, can be generally glossed as the practice of eating together, right? And so Mann is very interested in the book, talks about macaques and the feeding practices around macaques. around cattle even as well, and parakeets, right? The sort of sharing, the eating together, right? And so on the main chapter called The Politics of Commensality, you speak about middle-class anxieties overrun by macaques, this sort of classes is like attentiveness to feeding them for various astrological practices. You talk about the handlers who are now, chasers of these animals. And you sort of analytically highlight the majoritarian logics and rule by aesthetics that kind of seek to override this commensality that emerges, right? And even here, you talk about the minor practices of commensality that continue to trail behind them, right? And so I bring up this sort of conversation around commensality to sort of talk about the major and minor, but also commensality is something obviously I've thought about quite a bit in my own work, and this has to do with the question of caste primarily. Right. For myself and also for commensality, you speak about caste backgrounds of people, right? The middle-class Brahmin in this case. You mentioned, Valmiki, someone of a Valmiki caste background. But, commensality was and continues to be, right, a center of caste hierarchy. It is not necessary to rehearse, I think, the story, is probably familiar, right? But I just have a few questions to pose around caste as well as sort of commensality, right? And so first would be how would the casted nature of urbanism in South Asia fit into your narrative of the major and minor keys of urban theory, right? Caste, I imagine, could sit comfortably in both registers, right? Both major and minor. But one concern I have about the attention to other than human urbanisms, and this is something that I struggle with in my own writings quite often, is that it turns away from the social in the most traditional and conservative sense, right? And that those are the relations between humans differentiated along the lines of race, class, and gender, right? In other words, the social as a primary site for the exercise of power, right? I raise this once again, not as a, criticism of the work that you didn't do something that I want you to do, right? But rather a provocation to think through caste in relation to the theory of the urban that you chart out in this book. So I really want to hear how you would sort of engage with that, right? And this is sort of a bit of maybe slightly of a pedantic point, but I'm still kind of interested in this, right? In theories of caste and commensality, sort of older anthropological theories, right? The matter was the sharing of food between dominant castes and those of quote unquote lower caste backgrounds, right? And perhaps I missed this in the text, but there's not that kind of sharing, I think, between macaques, right? With macaques. It is the giving of food to macaques, right? Or they're stealing and taking of it, right? In other words, humans and macaques never sit down at the same table to share food, right? Humans wouldn't eat necessarily, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but humans wouldn't necessarily eat the food that they give macaques after giving it to them, correct? So indeed, humans either give food or macaques take food, right? It's a one-sided exchange, right? So, and this is really important as far as caste exchanges goes, right? Because dominant caste would give food, but it wouldn't take food from someone who would be seen as lower caste. So I have 1 minute left, and this is what I fear would have happened. I have a lot more comments, and one that I sort of just quickly say is that, I would be interested in hearing, especially when you talk about in one of the chapters around this, you identify this tension between biotic nativism and those upholding a more cosmopolitan view of nature, right? Between race-coded classificatory practices and a question of territorial origin as the criterion for accommodation, right? And you seem to be pushing, for understandable reasons, for a cosmopolitan view of nature, right? That nature is something that's actively made, not by just those who are, that nature that's sort of native to a place, right? But thinking about nature as cosmopolitan. And I'm sort of wondering what the implications of such an approach would be, both politically and intellectually. And this is, once again, a provocation. Does a cosmopolitan view of nature predisposed to one having a cosmopolitan view of human difference, right? And the kind of racial politics of a post-colonial London, which is where you're really writing about. So with that, I have other comments that maybe I can just say for the discussion. And so I'll end there and just say, this is, it was a really wonderful book, and I sort of both congratulate you and thank you, Iman, for writing this powerful and important text. And I think many of us will be reading and returning to this book for quite some time. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Waqas. We can move on directly to Asila.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much to Aparna and Nida for organizing this, and thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here and discuss this wonderful book. First of all, I think I would be touching on a lot of the points that were already raised, but in different ways. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book. Not only because it makes such important interventions in how we think about cities, but also because it very vividly captures how urban life is conjured by the city's more than human dwellers. So for me, the stories divulged here were surprising, exciting, but also deeply familiar. I think there's an important resonance here to our current urban condition in South Asia, particularly, where urban modernity and urbanization, as Man also writes, deemed irregular and incomplete, belie these life worlds that are ever constituting. What I mean to say is that we know the protagonists in this book, right? We come across them in our daily lives. We rely on them even, and yet they're not as visible in urban engagements as perhaps they should be. So what this book then proposes is taking those mundane encounters with more than human beings seriously, paying attention to the ways in which their circadian rhythms, sentient forces, histories, and improvisations produce our shared urban worlds. It's also ethnographically rich, and there's a wealth of conceptual grammars offered here that make visible their sentient lives and city-making processes, from the feral, cultivated, to the commensal, which I find all very useful and generative. For the purpose of this short input, I'll focus on some of the images and vocabularies that Man has offered us to reflect on how they bear on our shared realities. So I'll talk a little bit about the urban as meshwork, commensality, and how it appears in my research, and finally end with some questions regarding method. The first element that I would like to focus on is what Ash Amin and Nigel Thrift concur makes cities legible. Metaphors that anchor our conceptual understanding of cities. And in this book, the central metaphor is that of the meshwork, what is described as a heterogeneous web of relations in which humans and non-humans emerge as co-producers of the urban. I want to dwell on the usefulness of this metaphor because I think it has an important bearing on the relational ontologies of cities and on notions of justice. As the book argues, cities are not ready-made or ready pre-made designs in which life ensues, but ever-growing forms of improvisations and reenactments that produce its material reality. So the first implication that this meshwork has is that it decenters the role of the human as the primary or sole participant in the production of urban life and sociality. It further deters us from hierarchizing the role of humans and non-humans, encouraging instead to consider how our lives are endurably enmeshed. So the question of ontology then points us away from any singularity towards I think I'm also paraphrasing Man here, towards a parliament of multiple human and non-human life worlds that are indelibly interlinked. The second important bearing of this meshwork, I think, includes the political, environmental, and socio-ecological implications of situating humans and animals, our past, present, and futures, as caught up in one another. In the context of climate change and increased climate precarity for both humans and non-humans, the meshwork signals just how deeply intertwined we are as more than human worlds. To draw this out further, I will recall the argument made by Özge Yaka, another scholar concerned with more than human relationality, in her new book, Fighting for the River, Gender, Body, and Agency in Environmental Struggles, that I'm reading right now. And she says that it is not enough to speak of environmental justice because of its inherent anthropocentrism, framing as resource struggles and focus on distributive injustices. To foreground more than human relationality, she proposes a sense of socio-ecological justice in which our affective and bodily connections to non-human beings are incorporated into ideas of justice. So essentially, this is an exercise in laying bare the indivisions, I'm using one of her words here, indivisions between humans and non-humans. And so for me, the meshwork as a metaphor then provides also opportunities beyond the urban to think of relations as ontologically prior to entities, whether human or non-human. Thinking of meshworks then, or cities as meshworks in which the lives and material realities of humans and non-humans are interwoven, orients us not only intellectually, but also politically in climate justice practice and discourse to account for more than human beings. Perhaps this enmeshment also offers renewed focus on the ethics of care, of considering nature or non-humans not only as resource and capital production, but as vital forces with whom we have community. This brings me to the proposal here to think of the urban in a minor key, which I think is a great formulation, but I do have some questions. So while the metaphor opens up the analytical potentials of macaques repurposing infrastructures and parakeets resituating London's ecologies as post-colonial through what Mann calls a minor sensibility or an alternative to the grammars of major urban theory, I'm wondering how the minor differs from the marginal or the liminal that urban theory has been concerned with. So is the minor a question of scale or form or register, which major urban theory has ignored? Is the minor a reworking of liminality to foreground ecologies? Or is it something else entirely? Perhaps something for us to discuss later on. The second element I would like to focus on is the commensal and what it reveals regarding the limits of thinking cities through the lens of biopolitics, as Mann also shows us. So drawing on my own research, there's a resonance here that I hope to reiterate and offer another set of empirics to perhaps think this through. In my ethnography of roads in Karachi, I look at bird feeding practices in and alongside roads, particularly focusing on pigeons. Such sites are often marked by earthen plates or shallow wells of water on traffic circles or dividers where people stop by to feed birds. In many such sites, vendors sell an assortment of grains and rely on these provisioning practices to make a living. I think it's worth noting also that in many cities across the world, pigeon inhabitations are curtailed through the deployment of reproductive control and other anti-pigeon technologies, feeding bans, and so forth. And so feral pigeons and humans have a fraught commensal relationship. In Karachi, this friction between urban governance and pigeons is less resolute in a sense. It is marked instead by a concept of risk or provisioning sustenance in public culture that emphasizes an interconnected and shared cosmology of subsistence in which provisioning for animals as sadqa offers the human an embodied neki or goodness, incurring also relations with God who prescribes benefits to those who feed. The relationality here is one not produced by biopolitics, but by forms of commensality by which non-humans are invited to share, inhabit, and produce public spaces through material forms of provisioning grains and water. So this is not to say that biopolitical interventions in cities are not happening in animal lives in Karachi. Commensality also has a darker side. For example, when municipalities lay out poison to eradicate street dogs. So these processes are not entirely convivial, as Mann also notes, of how bovine wayfaring remakes pastures in the city that are toxic still, but ways of making do. So essentially, this is to reiterate the argument in the book that the frame of biopolitics that is often transferred as an analytic from Western cities is not enough, perhaps, to capture human-animal relations taking shape in the urban. And the analytic of commensality opens up other inquiries and engagements, and this is something I find also generative in my research. Finally, the third element I would like to discuss goes back to the meshwork and the place of methods in tracing them. So I'm interested in thinking about what kind of ethnographic commitments this tracing of human and non-human enmeshments require. without interviews, an important mode in ethnographic inquiries, although some scholars doing multi-species ethnographies have claimed to, quote unquote, interview plants. I'm not sure I agree with such formulations, or they don't particularly make sense to me. So, in that sense, without interviews, what kind of retooling needs to happen to the ways we observe non-humans? It's also worth noting that this book, as Vikas also pointed out, gives us a reading of the archives to situate animals and urban histories. So I'm wondering for Man, because he doesn't explicitly say this in the book, if this is a call in some sense for geographers or ethnographers to open up their inquiries to an interdisciplinary commitment. What does it mean to consider animals as ethnographic participants in that sense? And does the ethnographer need help from the ethologist or the ecologist, or the other way around? What does one learn or unlearn when such an interdisciplinary approach is undertaken? I have more questions here than answers, but I'm curious what you think. And yeah, I hope I've been on time. And yeah, thanks for listening, and thanks for writing this book.
Thank you, Asila. Let's move to our final respondent. Avadinda, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join in the conversation. Thank you, Man, for writing the book. Questions about the minor have been asked. I won't go there for the moment, but there's several important things here. The book is anything but a minor book. There's a lot of interesting insights there to think with. And like Man himself, it's gently combative, but always combative. It's also beautifully written. So I really enjoyed reading it, Man, and I hope we can have you over in Delhi sometime soon to talk about the book. Vikas and Asila have raised some important issues that Man deals with, having to do with minor, major, commensality, meshwork, biopolitics. In some senses, covering a lot of the ground the book is concerned with. So what I'm going to do is translate the book for myself and probably for the audience into three kinds of questions that I think the book is asking. And hopefully Man will correct me if I got him wrong. The first is a very simple question of what is the city composed of? The second is the question, how is this composition done? And following from this is a third thing that Man hints at, doesn't push it very far, but if we have a good grasp of what the city is composed of and how it is composed, then how does this understanding enable us to dwell in the city in a more hospitable and a habitable way? Now Man's, towards the concluding section, he writes, this is not a manifesto, but I think it's not also just about writing otherwise. There is a sense in the book of the possibility of living otherwise. And I think there's something there for all of us to learn from, to celebrate, and to think with Man as we go along in this conversation. What Man also does beautifully for us, you'd recollect, it's been a decade and more when Jennifer Robinson wrote her Ordinary Cities, where she writes about the first world being the site of urban theory and the third world of urban problems. And what this book does is beautifully, without getting a huge polemics, presents to us a model of writing in a very sophisticated, theoretical, which is also very richly ethnographic manner, to think about cities across the world. And this is a gesture that I found very enriching, that you bring and develop concepts for understanding life in one part of the world, don't simply replicate in another part of the world, but use it to think with about lives led elsewhere. And that kind of comparative gesture that he does with London and Delhi, I found it fascinating to think with, and I hope that more comparative work of this kind can be done. Of course, and what Man says on a couple of occasions, that this is not about erasing difference, but about thinking about different places through concepts that are generated everywhere in the world, and not just in some geographies. Okay, so on the first question, what is the city composed of? I think the main interlocutor for Mann here is this whole idea of planetary urbanism and theories of the kind which look at systems and logics rather than ethnographies of lives led. And I think that he's trying to suggest is not simply the many elements that the city is composed of, which is humans, other than human animals, matter, architecture, infrastructure, all kinds of things, but to see these not as simply as the outcome of a logic, but as part of a process through which interaction happens, which in turn produces the city. So it's not as, and this is something that he repeats over and over and over again. So there's no way that any reader can miss it, that it's not a pre-designed city that we simply inhabit. Now, I read that section very carefully and went through those parts, partly because the idea of adaptation has become so critical, especially so if you look at this whole climate discourse, it's around these two words, mitigation and adaptation. And what Mann has argued very powerfully is adaptation is not enough to understand how cities become lively cities, or how cities are lively in the first place. And I think there's a lot to think with and speculate about. How do you push this idea of adaptation towards an idea of composition, of making cities, which is what he's calling lively cities. On the second proposition, is this, again, it's not simply design versus non-design. A lot of this, there's certain slipperiness there, and what's one of the beauty of his language, that it's not as if he's making, okay, here's design, here's non-design, here's my point of view. Kind of leads you through these things that the minor is not the subaltern, and then he'll give you some clue as to why he thinks about it. Similarly, he speaks of the opposite of design not being spontaneity or non-design, but a certain kind of understanding that comes together, which is what he calls this recombinant urbanism, about which he writes at length in different parts of the book. For a quick one, for those of you who are interested in reading the book, I think a quick useful paragraph is on page 133 on what he means by this recombinant urbanism. Similarly, on variation, which is, as he argues, is not the same as variance, and why variation becomes important. He talks about flight and those kinds of things. Pretty early on in the book, the first 30, 40 odd pages, you find that. So there are these ways in which he suggests that there are ways of trying to understand how this composition comes about. There's nothing given. You just don't place things side by side and then say that they add up to something. It's the relationship as it is forged, which is where, the point that Waqas made about caste becomes very important. I'll come back to it in a moment. Just two other things that Mann combines with this, which I found very, very interesting for my purposes. Again, not, there's no simple definition, but there's a description of these things. One is infra-politics, which he says is not, is not subaltern politics, is not, and basically what he's saying, it's not, I mean, he uses an interesting phrase, it's a politics that dare not speak its name. He's kind of poetic writer, but I think what he's trying to suggest is not a conscious, organized politics of any scale. And there's something again there to work with. Are these forms of infra-politics across different moments, different sites, different scales the same? How do we work with this notion of infra-politics? Does it have a direction, or is it simply random and non-directional? So there's a lot to work with that. And similar to the idea of molecular economy that he takes from Aditya Nigam and pushes it further, which is forms not of pre-capitalism, but within capitalism, non-capitalist forms as they live and thrive, which is what allows him, I think, quite beautifully to develop this whole idea of the pastoral city and the agrarian city. And so what it does, I think, through all this is, without quite getting this boundary of the city and the countryside, or the usual boundaries that we work with, looks at these different scales, how they come together, how they pull apart, and in some senses, together, they kind of allow for this vitality of the city, which in his reading also has to do with how, birds and cows and monkeys and other animals shape and reshape forms of behavior, both of humans and other, animals. So it's a world of many animals who shape and reshape each other's ways of being, and also shape and reshape human worlds in interesting ways. And this comes through in whether it's talking about the parakeets, or he's talking about the cows, or he's talking about the monkeys in the early part of the book, how they are active agents in shaping and reshaping the world, and not simply adapting to it. And this, I think, in some senses, offers some of the clues with which I try to read the book. It raises for me 3 questions that I want to push Man on. You are at 9 minutes, so okay, let me give 30 seconds to each. On the caste question, I think the point has already been made. I only want to push it one step further, Vikas, which is, can you have an account of lively cities that is not simultaneously an account of fear and prejudice? Fear, literally fear for lives. So can you think of cow and commensality at a time when eating beef can get you murdered? And where does that fear come into this discussion of the lively city? And this can do with religion, this could do with caste, this could do with several other things. So I do want to push that point about caste and social difference even further, because what you're looking at is a very fragile moment where lives can be curtailed, lost on account of some of these things. The other thing that I wanted to push a bit on, Man, this has to come with the idea of the future. Now, in your discussion in the London chapter, you write, and I think quite correctly, about the way in which this anticipation of a future where the native is going to be overrun by the quote-unquote foreigner, whether it's human or non-humans, and therefore a certain kind of racism being inbuilt into future-oriented thinking. I then want to push you, is that always the case? Can we any longer think public health without imagining scenarios and futures? And will all such scenarios and futures be racist? Post-pandemic, I don't think that any of us can any longer imagine the world to be what it has always been. And so in that sense, imagination of the future is very much part of how the current city is being built. And there's a lot to think with. My final comment, especially and largely because this is in a climate workshop, is simply that I sense that much of the writing about the city in this book, as in several other books, remains horizontal. And I think while the wires and the meshwork and all those make an appearance, I think the aerial city is yet to find its own. And atmospherics has become a big part with which to think about the urban. And I think it's useful to think how we can bring that aerial city into discussions of the kind that Man has given us. So thank you very much, Man. Thank you very much for inviting us. And yeah, I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Man, if you want to kind of respond to the respondents for about 8 to 10 minutes, then we can open it up to a broader conversation.
Thank you so much, Nida and Aparna, for hosting this, but also especially Vikas, Asila, and Deepu, Avadhendra, Sharan, for such rich, such rich comments, which kind of every time there's a kind of meeting or encounter like this, one starts to think of one's own work in a completely new way. So it's always deeply enriching. But your comments, all of your comments have been incredibly generous. What I will try to do is maybe work through them serially as I've noted them, but also I think there are lots of overlapping concerns. So hopefully some of it will be addressed in that way. But Vikas, I completely agree with so many of the things you have to say about, the minor as thinking about the otherwise, about thinking from cramped spaces of expression. But in terms of, I think, how I came to this and where is the otherwise coming from, it really is a kind of deep unease with every field I work with. And I tend to work fairly horizontally. So for instance, this work is situated in South Asian studies in one way you can think of it, even if you think of the London end, but yet it's not plonked right in the middle of South Asian studies. It's the sort of unease with that sort of ways in which problems have been problematized, so to speak, and it's trying to do something different. And in the similar way, I think I'm coming at urban sociology or urban anthropology, urban geography from a pretty left kind of direction. But the third thing, which can seem quite central to the book, which for lack of a better word now is being bandied about in terms of multi-species studies, it's also my deep unease with that body of work. And the term I prefer is actually more than human, because this book or even social lives are not so much about species worlds, but are actually about human and other than human entities that continuously relate, collide, endure one another. So this sort of take on writing the otherwise really comes from an unease, and as Awadhendra Sharan mentioned, there's a kind of combative, pugnacious sort of edge to the text because of this. But I think that unease can be immensely generative for saying, okay, what else can we say about cities? There's already tomes and tomes and tomes, and does this allow us to think of something differently? And therefore, the kind of the concepts that I've tried to draw out, and you kind of rightly mentioned commensality, comes from this sort of entry point. And here, my entry point actually into commensality was less through the more established sort of angle in anthropology, but actually was thinking about it through the insights of ecology, because they use the term commensal to talk about urban macaques. So I was saying, okay. But interestingly enough, if you read the book, there's this, the entire politics around commensality here is happening with the Delhi government trying to remove the macaques and, people flaunting rules and so on and so forth. But at one moment, this becomes a major court case. And the municipal corporation argues that these are wild animals, and the responsibility for removing monkeys from the city should go to the forest department. And in the court case, the forest department starts to say, well, these are actually not wild, these are commensal animals that have adapted to living in parks and so on and so forth. So the responsibility should be on the municipal corporation. So each of them are trying to shun responsibility, but it's a very interesting use of the term commensal. And I think it's at that kind of juncture in that court case where I started thinking, wow, okay, how is it that they're mobilizing this idea to shun responsibility? But it just sort of speaks to these broader things that people in CSTS and elsewhere have also kind of extensively written about, thinking about productive failure, right? How do you engage with this whole problem of failure? And I think it's at that moment, with the kind of use by the bureaucrats plus the ecological aspect, that I really started to think with the commensal. But you're spot on in terms of how there's definitely a caste dimension, or cross human, non-human divide here, because as you say, we wouldn't eat the food that's given to the macaques. So is this really an exchange? And I think where the exchange really happens is probably in terms of an immaterial exchange, the sort of harnessing of a divine energy from the macaque. So you feed it a banana, but you get punya, right? So I think it's material and semiotic in terms of its exchange. But and the analytic of commensality was, and here Asila mentions this as well, when you see commensal relations in Karachi, it's this analytic that one could actually take to London. So actually I started looking at, wow, Delhi and these practices of feeding, and when you come to London, you suddenly realize, gosh, people are feeding parakeets and birds, but the relations that get configured are very different. So in a way, this was a gesture to try and kind of reverse the gaze, to say, well, why don't we generate some concepts in Delhi or Karachi or wherever, and take them to London? What does London start to look like? So I think that was the gesture. And then you start seeing the post-colonial city, which comes to the third point that you made about the cosmopolitan. And I think the cosmopolitan imagination has in some ways failed, but it's something maybe one could hold on to, because the moment you start looking at nature in London, especially through a figure like the parakeet, as opposed to, say, a native oak tree or the goldfinch, you see how these relations about how nature is configured gets unsettled, right? So it was a kind of I chose the parakeet deliberately to, unsettle kind of notions of belonging and home and so on and so forth. This kind of takes me then to Asila's points about the meshwork and how I try to think about it. I think there are kind of four sets of thoughts here in terms of using this term, which I take from the anthropologist Tim Ingold. One is to really kind of move from the idea of bodies being bound entities to trying to think about enmeshment, that instead of embodiment, that the body is formed through its relations with other bodies, with the environment, with feed, and so on and so forth. So moving in a way from boundedness to relations. I think the second gesture with the meshwork was to move from kind of multi-species worlds, these dyadic worlds of humans and animals, to more than human worlds where these relations are mediated by spirits or astral bodies and so on and so forth. But and I hope this was kind of clear in the book, that I'm not prescribing a flat ontology. In fact, that would be my critique of actor network theory and so on and so forth. Of course, some actor, even if you use their language, some actors marshal the actions of others. So therefore, I think it's really about hierarchy. Although it is calling for an expanded ontology of the urban, it's not to say that these by summoning ontology, hierarchy goes away. It doesn't. In fact, it just comes back to bite. And this kind of brings me back to this this question that you raised also in relation to the meshwork, was about justice, right? And for me, the meshwork summons in some ways some forms of more just forms of urban living, not really from the elite environmentalism that Avadindra Sharan has written about, or in the Delhi context, Amitabh Bhaskar and people, or neither is it from this kind of animal welfare angle, which has become so central to how these sort of multi-species studies tend to talk about politics and belonging and so on and so forth. For me, what really matters are the alignments between people who might be marginalized for various reasons and the practices that they're enmeshed in. And I think those practices, those alignments, are maybe a starting point for thinking, okay, what constitutes justice? So, outside of this context and outside of this example, you can think of, people rearing chickens in Guwahati, which is what I've been doing right now. The bird is, from an animal rights viewpoint, the bird will be slaughtered. So, what is the ethics and politics there? But if you think of marginalized urban lives and the slaughtering of the animal that they keep, then it opens up all kinds of other questions. And I think, especially when you work in the South Asian context, I think the whole politics around meat eating and so on and so forth are complicated precisely because what all three of you have mentioned, this question of caste, right? And vilifying people who are much closer to the corporeal, to the and who have much more haptic sort of relations with that which is seen as sort of foul, which is seen as unclean, and so on and so forth. But I think it's expanding this. The other point that you raised, Asila, is about this wider question of public culture. And when you talk about Sadga and so on and so forth, there's some wonderful work by this guy called Pinault, who's written about the Chil Sadga in Pakistan, and Anand Vivek Taneja's work, for instance, on jinns and feeding of kites and so on and so forth. I think what's very interesting here, and maybe we could ask this question, is what really then becomes of public culture when we bring all these sort of entities into the fray. What happens when jinns and astral bodies and all of these things which are real, right? What happens? to the public. And just to think about it, Delhi's figure of Monkey Man, which has been extensively written about, Aditya Nigam's written about it as well. Just summoning an entity like that into the fray of making claims for infrastructure becomes very interesting, right? How is it that suddenly people start getting, the police starts getting hoax calls that Monkey Man has appeared, and all these colonies suddenly have electricity power restored. The other point, of course, is about method, which keeps coming up. I'll just be brief, but I can say two things. One, I think, is it's not, we have to stop thinking about the humanist register here. In some ways, it's not entirely suspended, because you do need to talk to people. But what I think is productive is when you follow animals, it takes you to uncanny urban spaces, which you might not notice otherwise. If you didn't follow the cow, you wouldn't see that little gully in that informal settlement that becomes a labyrinth, and so on and so forth. Or one might not, so this book, although it's about non-humans and animals and so on and so forth, it is also about a whole set of urban interlocutors who are beyond the usual suspects of urban theory, right? The banana vendor, and which these are not epiphenomena, and this is precisely what I'm trying to argue about the writing otherwise. These are not epiphenomena, but we need to look at these sorts of practices as well. But I think it's also about talking to extended gatekeepers. If you talk, so ethology, yes, is very important, but also, the monkey chasers, they have their whole own vernacular ethology of how macaques behave. And I think those explanations become really, really interesting. And this is some of the collaborative work I've been doing with the ethologist Anindya Sinha. We've been thinking about this, and we have a PhD student, Anmol Chaudhary, who's been looking into this deeper. But when I talked to some of these monkey chasers, it was remarkable, because they had all kinds of explanations about, what a macaque does and what a macaque is. And I think those kinds of vernacular knowledges become really, really vital. Going back now to Avadhendra's comments, and thank you so much, because your work has really influenced this book, especially your wonderful historical work on the rural and the question about expunging the rural from the city, which you see how this is sort of comes back. So there's that one moment where there's a cattle dairy colony that's set up in Ghoga, and on top of the houses for cattle, people are building building their own structures. And somebody says, well, this is for cattle, and the president of the cattle dairy owners organization says, well, these people are actually rural, and for them, living next to cattle is a way of life. So here you see how with Maya and the master plan, the whole trope which you've written about extensively, Avadhendra, how the expunging of rurality now comes back to bite, right? And that's, for me, the real was the kind of critique of planetary urbanization. That is this total urbanization, or does the rural, because as so many people like Shibra Gururani and so on and so forth have argued, that is the urban and agrarian question in India? And if so, how do we kind of push that thinking further? And what you see is that this sort of the agrarian or the rural morphs into something different, but it's never it's never eliminated. And here I think the critique of, in a way, a critique or sympathetic critique, I hope, of planetary urbanization is not just looking at urban form, but then asking the question of what is capitalism, right? Because that version of planetary urbanization comes with the political economy. And I think here the kind of variegated forms of capitalism that we see in India, Aditya Nigam's really important argument of non-capitalist relations being within capitalist ones. But you could also think of Kalyan Sanyal's work, that you can have circuits of capital that begin with money and end with producing surplus, but the surplus is invested into simple commodity production. So it's not expanded accumulation that you would see in a capitalist circuit. And I think that's really, really important, so that we kind of also have an economy that comes with it. Your third point, that, well, this book, what about the prescriptions, right? What does this sort of, if you know how a city is composed differently and what this composition does, what happens to this question of prescription? And I think this relates to the other question around turbulent futures, that if you think of cities in the West, that the futures increasingly being summoned as turbulent. Almost to this point where so much of kind of contemporary biopolitics moves from that trope of modernity of the future, being heralded, to keeping the future at bay, right? That the future is chaotic, the future must be kept at bay, and therefore infrastructures are cited. This whole resilience sort of argument, infrastructures are cited to keep catastrophe somewhere on the horizon, so that it doesn't kind of come and get us. And I think this question of turbulence in prescription, I think, really become important, because then how do we move from this question of adaptation to modes of composition that could be generative? And I have to admit, this book I finished writing in 2021, just when kind of COVID was in its midway, and maybe the book was written with way too much hope, I think, because what you see in this begs to this question, how can you talk about commensality or cattle without looking at the continual evisceration of, human life? And I think what we are confronted with now is really a condition of carcerality. I've been doing field work in Guwahati, where you see people are kind of being raised to the ground, they come back, they again raised to the ground. The machine is relentless. But I mean, as a historian, I probably, and I put this question back to you as a historian, that should we think too much in presentist terms, or is there something we can draw from a kind of palimpsest of the city, kind of historicity, that allows us to say, well, maybe this moment too shall pass? But just to kind of go back on the last point, and I'll finish here, is this wonderful evocation of atmospherics. I think, the kind of volumetric question around governance, I think, is important. But I've been recently thinking more in terms of also this idea of metabolics, that, we see power really shifting, even in the Indian context, from disciplinary power to power becoming what Foucault called environmental. Like, not the Arun Agrawal version of environmentality, but environmental being the channeling of circulations and coding their flows. So you see how now the control of pollution from, say, poultry units is about how do you regulate what feed you give to the chicken. What would the kind of pollutants go into the environment, and so on and so forth. There are all kinds of regulations that are being put in place, both in the UK and in India. So that's where I've been thinking about. So this idea of a metabolic politics. So I think with the atmospheric, we also need to start thinking of the sort of metabolic politics of regulating not just what we eat, but what we eats, and the political consequences of that. But thank you so much for such a rich set of provocations, and it's really, really nice to be able to talk to scholars who work on the urban, because that's really the audience I wanted to address. So I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists and to Maan for the dialogue that is, emerging from this book. I have like pages of notes, both from my reading of it as well as from this panel, and have like a whole other set of questions and provocations, which really speaks to the richness and thickness of ideas and theories that are emerging in the book. And as Avadendra and others mentioned, is also just very beautifully written. I don't want to spend too much time. I was going to do a little bit more work summarizing the comments across the panelists, but I don't want to spend too much time doing that. But I do think that a couple of aspects that came across the comments were, the idea of living and thinking otherwise, and what that means and what that looks like in relation to the marginal, in relation to perhaps more state-driven ideas. The other was the political implications of the minor key, and kind of the minor brought up in a whole range of different ways, both in the book as well as in the responses. And another thing that came across was rethinking and working through binaries in ways that don't only think of them as like antagonistic, but what does it really mean to move across those? Finally, and I think questions of caste and commensality came across in different ways across the panelists. I had a couple of additional prompts or questions. You can see whether you what of that you want to take up. And also, of course, we can open it up to other questions and comments that others in the audience have. The first was, my first point was just, about questions of mobility, of animals, of matter, in questions of migration, the role of infrastructure. And so I thought that like the theme of mobility came up in different ways across the book, and how, whether it is to thinking about like just what you're saying about like following the animals leads you to different spaces and different interlocutors. So also in questions of mobility in relation to methods, which I thought was an interesting thing that came across the book. And this is something you mentioned in your comments as well, is how we can think about animals and how they operate alongside other actors. And I thought it was remarkable how doing this and tracking this process helped rethink and expand upon various existing theories of infrastructure, questions of urban agrarianism, of commons, of informality, and just of urbanism more broadly. So I think this process of thinking of animals alongside other actors was worked out very productively. Yeah, so those were just some aspects. I don't know if you want to take them up as prompts. And finally, I was wondering about if you could talk a little bit to something that was unexpected or something that became a sticky point that that gave you pause, or that perhaps created some kind of discomfort, whether it's in the process of research or in writing. I mean, I know you spoke a little bit about your discomfort with various different theories and space, that kind of thing. But I don't know if there was something else that comes to mind when you think of that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Aparna. Those are wonderful comments. I mean, let me, talk about the last one first. I think, I mean, definitely with caste, I think that the element of gender. So our PhD student who's working on this project, Shruti Raghavan, I think she might be here as well, has been doing some wonderful ethnography of cattle in Delhi and Guwahati. And one thing she kind of argues in her work, which I think is fantastic, is that, in this book, there's this sort of take that, oh, well, cattle prize open, other spaces of being otherwise in the urban. But what her work shows is that actually these can also become highly gendered places, so it's not that, oh, suddenly, the urban worlds created by the other than human are liberatory. I think, they can get remorphed in other ways. So I think certainly the other directions this can be taken, I think, is one point. But in terms of the marginal and the minor, and I think this is raised by many people, but including Abhatendra Sharan, on this question, then what is the politics to it? And I think, well, there are two questions. I think one is, of course, if you think about infrapolitics, that this is not an organized kind of politics, right? So infrapolitics sort of operates under the thresholds of detectability. So people kind of saying, oh, the monkeys ripped off all our meters, so therefore, it's about evading state scrutiny, right? And all the inventive ways in which people do so. You can call it jugaad, you can call it what you want, but I think that's really interesting. But it is, I think, really difficult to organize urban politics along these sorts of lines. I think there's an element of spontaneity that happens, or similarly with Monkey Man and the call for and the kind of ways in which staples are accessed. But you also see the sort of molecular politics happening with the way people have dairies in urban settings, right? So the municipality will come for inspections, but they're tipped off in advance, and the cattle are pushed through a hole in the wall, and the cattle no longer are there. So I think that's a politics of evasion, which I think is really interesting. But whether this can take an organized form, I'm really, really doubtful about. But then this question of the minor versus the marginal, and I think what I'm trying to argue, at least, I'm not saying that, oh, we should get rid of the politics of marginality in those forms of organization. Absolutely not, especially with the ways in which capital is coming back to bite. You need all kinds of, all forms of organization. But I think what the minor does is that also allows one to see how the minor can emerge from existing hierarchies as a kind of line of flight. So, the kind of tapping into electricity, improvisation, summoning, the macaque as having stolen all the meters, and therefore we can't pay, we don't have a meter to monitor our bills, so to speak. I think the minor kind of emerges from the major, and this goes back right to the first point that Waqas made, that that I'm not shunning the major, and it's like a shadow trailing a thing, that you can't have the shadow without the thing. So it is the articulation of the two. And I think where the minor kind of goes off is that it can work from the major and rework it from within. So I think that is the the politics of possibility that the book is signaling. But these would be points I would add. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else in the audience wanted to raise any questions. We'd love to give some time for that. Well, while you're thinking about that, I mean, I can always ask more questions. Nida, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I can, and if anybody else wants to interrupt me, that's also fine. Man, maybe if I may ask you to elaborate a little bit on one point. I am very, very taken with yours and others' work, especially the work that you are kind of looking through to think about the agrarian question in relation to cities and South Asian urbanization. I am, I think what you're saying right at the end of the discussion earlier was about how it's not just about looking at the form of the agrarian, how it emerges and is immanent, as you said, within the urban, but also what does it then say about capitalism? What kinds of questions one might ask about it? And I think here, obviously, histories of agrarian development are really key. I know, Waqas, you also deal with this in your work and many others. So I'm wondering where you think of that kind of question of kind of how to kind of rethink capitalism within urban theory with respect to the agrarian question, or what you might have. And I'm happy to kind of open this to others as well.
That's a tough one. I mean, I think that there's a lot of people who've worked extensively on kind of varieties of capitalism and so on and so forth. But I think okay, the way I'll answer this and try to avoid answering the question is what one shouldn't do. And I think it's very common for those of us who are kind of schooled in some ways in Marxist political economy to impose categories onto situations, and I think that can become limiting, because that is precisely what a major canon does. And Deepu mentioned Jennifer Robinson, the idea of theory here, problem somewhere else. It replicates that entire thing. So I think not to counter that, but to work more creatively, I think maybe three things with a political economy, and therefore the study of capitalism could do, at least which interests me. One is the historicity to it, to say, okay, well, and therefore there was this. I made a conscious effort to look at the archives in Delhi, right? What does this tell us about cattle and the problem of the surplus animal and so on and so forth? So the historicity, because then you see it's these divergences between London and Delhi that become constitutive. That is not comparing like and like, but to say how do trajectories differ. So I think certainly that element of history. I think the second question is also therefore about the relation between, I think, capital and some kind of biopolitics. Because if you think of the question of the subsumption of life by capital as a question of biopolitics, then, how do we deal with that question? And I think, in South Asian context, I would argue that, biopolitics is to be seen as a kind of partial project. It's unfinished, right? And it morphs and so on and so forth. People can contradict me, but I'm maybe talking in a league beyond me. But the third thing, I think, is also a kind of reworking of some of the categories of political economy. So rather than seeing, how is value produced, or what counts as work, if you take the non-human world just to be raw material in the typical Marxist sense, the volume 1 argument, then, I mean, can you trouble that? What if the cattle is both fixed and variable capital at the same time, which is what it is, right? Because as a worker, it's converting waste into value through milk. So, those divisions between, say, fixed and variable capital start to break down. So I think an inflection like that could be generative for really thinking of the question of capital. Yeah, these sort of 3 points.
Thank you. We have another 10 minutes or so before we wrap up. Does anybody else have thoughts, questions?
Do you mind if if anyone in the audience has a question, then feel free to. I just had, this was sort of related to the conversation that was just happening about the sort of the agrarian urban question, and it was sort of one of my comments. So I'm kind of curious to see what you kind of say, and I think it relates to kind of what Nidha was asking about the histories of sort of agrarianism or the agrarian in relationship to sort of capitalist urbanization, I guess. But I wonder, I mean, I really like that kind of chapter on pastoral formations, and and this is partly doing some research that I've been thinking about, I guess. But it's sort of the figure of the agrarian was the sort of animal out of place and out of time in some level, right? That even in your own language of sort of how the cattle returns to the city and these kinds of things. But, I wonder something like, the relationship for example, water to the agrarian, right? And sort of this is coming out of, work around Punjab and around canal colonization and water change and this kind of stuff. And how does, because there's a relation, I mean, my sort of research, and not to get too much, but there's a relationship between provisioning of water to animals that's very sort of embedded in agrarian landscapes that sort of now is weirdly being reproduced, at least in sort of the outskirts of Lahore. So I just wonder kind of this agrarian, the rethinking of the agrarian question, how would it look vis-a-vis something like water, right? As opposed to the animal. And the animal and water are so, I mean, a lot of the field work I did were so connected, and, various canals that have gone away, are the sites of roads now. And sort of there is this sort of like accretion of infrastructure that's happening as well. So I wanted to sort of put it out on the table, and I don't know if Manda sort of elicits anything in you, but your work definitely, the chapter elicited it kind of in my own mind. So yeah.
Man, if I could just add to what Vikas was asking, that chapter is fascinating. So it seems even for you, there are forms of the agrarian. So, or maybe not for you, but there's certain kinds of agrarian life forms that seem desirable and have almost become part of middle class desire now. Say, for example, urban agriculture is a very, how do I say, it's a very in thing to do. But the cow roaming around is a sight that you don't want in a city that aspires to be global. So I think is it worth reflecting what of the agrarian gets drawn in, and what, at least in the major way, the powerful forces want to expel?
No, I mean, you're spot on. There is a kind of aesthetic politics that works time and time again, right? So what is loved and what isn't? The monkey or the in the sense the cattle, you don't want it, or it's seen as an affront, and in the Delhi context, because I mean, first there's the colonial desire to remove it on kind of grounds of hygiene and so on and so forth. Then with the kind of post-colonial anxiety around slums, and these the so-called slum being where the cattle are and so on. And even Maya talks about how the rurality is that these people are used to living next to cattle, and so you see that continuously working. And I mean, what do the elites want? And that's an interesting question, right? The kind of aesthetics. I think some of, in terms of the urban natures, and I think some of Nitin Batla's work is quite interesting in Delhi, that he's been working on some, this sort of reforestation and regeneration and so on and so forth, and how that there's a middle class optic that determines what it is. And on the question of urban agriculture is very interesting, because if you look at cities in Europe, for instance, just to kind of shift the context, but I think it's relevant, is that it's making a big comeback, through, not big comeback, but some kind of comeback through these arguments about rewilding the city and renaturing the city. But there's also the other element of how urban agriculture is so vital for migrants in terms of social reproduction. So there's been quite a bit of work on that, which I think is interesting. So, again, the politics, like, okay, maybe in the South, agriculture is now kind of liked for a very different reason by elites, but here there's that other dimension. So I think it's also the question of not just when, but where, and it's absolutely, I think, very interesting, the kind of reformulation of the agrarian, and what we value, what we don't. And Waqas, I mean, your question is almost is really kind of music to my ears, because I've been recently doing some work on wetlands in Guwahati, and the question one could ask is the urban and amphibious question, in the sense that so many cities around the world are actually built around wetlands. Chicago, New York, London, Delhi, maybe not so much, but it's very strong element of water and things there. But Guwahati certainly, and got me thinking about this, and therefore sort of begs this other question that what if we started building concepts not from dry ground, but from wetness, and what would these sort of ideas look like? I think one distinction that, I mean, I don't know so much about water, but I mean, water, because the water has been done in so many ways, right? Bottled water, and then water as a staple, and so on and so forth, but water also as habitat. But from this Guwahati work, what's emerging and what is very interesting is the politics around urban wetlands, and the politics around urbanization, and the form that it takes. And it's really remarkable. I mean, there's some stuff, actually, some of the planetary urbanization people are doing in a very interesting way, talking about plotting urbanization, how the urban expands plot by plot. And this is not, your grand visions of large-scale speculation and building and so on and so forth. And in cities like Guwahati, you see this, and it's partly also to do with how people intervene materially in wetlands. So they fill it up, some amount of capital put in, and then they go and settle there. Then, slowly real estate kind of markets move into those areas. So the very form of urbanization takes something very different, and it's absolutely, I mean, we should talk more about it, but yeah, I think this whole urbanist and amphibious question is very, very fascinating.
I definitely don't want to cut short the conversation, but I'm cognizant that we are nearly at time. Thank you so much, Toman, for this amazing book. Thank you to the panelists for their really thoughtful provocations that have helped formulate, I think, a very rich discussion. And thank you to the audience for coming and joining in this conversation. Just a couple of announcements. We are going to be sharing a call for projects soon from the South Asian Urban Climates Collective. So we will email everybody about it soon, so keep an eye out for that. And we also are in the process of planning other events soon, so that's another thing. And if you do want to be added to the listserv of South Asian Urban Climates Collective, please, please email Nida and or me. We're happy to add you. I am going to post the link to the website again over here, just in case someone wasn't there at the start of the conversation and would like to have a look at it. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of this discussion. And Yeah, with that, we can close this panel right on time, miraculously.
Big thank you from me too. Thank you to the panelists, to the audience, and Man. It's been such a nice experience. Thank you.
No, thank you, Asila, Waqas, Deepu, and Aparna, and Nida, especially, for everything you've done. It's remarkable and it's amazing. And I really hope we can kind of do more things with the urban climates. And it's an amazing initiative. And it's really great to be part of this conversation with you all.
Yeah, thank you. I have to run off, but thank you so much, Man, everyone else as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, and it's great to see some of you guys again, and nice to meet you too, Asila and Avendra. Yeah, take care.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Speak to you all soon. Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks so much. I've got to dash as well, but sorry, Nida, Aparna, I've got to kind of dash off, but we'll be in touch. Yeah, we can maybe be in touch over email and stuff.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so
Bye.
much. Cheers.